The Forest of Whispers. Chapter 1, The Dare. The small town of Ravenswood had always been surrounded by mysteries. Locals whispered about the ancient forest on its outskirts, a place so dense and dark that sunlight barely pierced its canopy. The Forest of Whispers, they called it, and for good reason. The trees, gnarled and twisted, seemed to groan with secrets, and if you stood still long enough, you'd swear you could hear faint voices carried on the wind. One chilly autumn evening, a group of friends, Ethan, Sarah, Mike, and Lily, gathered around a bonfire, the flames flickering in the crisp air. "Come on, guys, we've heard the stories a million times," Ethan scoffed, tossing another log onto the fire. "They're just tales to keep kids from getting lost." "But are they?" Lily asked, her voice barely above a whisper. She was the quietest of the group, but also the most curious. Her wide, dark eyes glimmered with a mix of fear and intrigue. "No one who goes in ever comes out the same. My grandma told me about a man who entered that forest years ago. When he came back, he was different. He never spoke again." Mike rolled his eyes. "Lily, it's all nonsense. Superstitions and old wives' tales. The only thing creepy about that forest is the fact that it's old and overgrown." Ethan grinned, his eyes lighting up with mischief. "How about we prove it? We could use a little adventure. We go in, take some pictures, and come out to show everyone there's nothing to be afraid of." Sarah hesitated. She wasn't one for ghost stories, and something about the idea of entering that forest felt wrong, like they were tempting fate. "I don't know, Ethan. What if something happens?" Ethan shrugged. "We'll stick together. We'll be in and out in no time. Besides, don't you want to be the one to tell everyone how we braved the infamous Forest of Whispers?" The group exchanged uneasy glances. Finally, Lily nodded. "Okay. But we don't go too deep, all right?" "Deal," Ethan agreed. "Let's do it." Chapter 2, Into the Abyss. Night had fully descended by the time they reached the edge of the forest. The moon was hidden behind thick clouds, leaving only the dim light of their flashlights to guide them. The towering trees loomed over them like sentinels, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. "This place gives me the creeps," Sarah muttered, sticking close to Ethan as they walked. Mike chuckled, though there was an edge to his voice. "Relax, Sarah. It's just a bunch of trees." As they ventured deeper, the air grew colder, and the ground beneath their feet turned soft and spongy. The forest was eerily silent, save for the occasional rustling of leaves, though there was no wind. "Anyone else feel like we're being watched?" Lily whispered, her eyes darting around nervously. "It's just your imagination," Ethan replied, though he too had begun to feel a growing sense of unease. The deeper they went, the thicker the fog became, swirling around their ankles and rising higher with each step. It wasn't long before they realized they were hopelessly lost. "Wait, wasn't that tree on our left before?" Mike asked, his voice shaky as he pointed to a large, knotted oak. Ethan frowned. "We must have gone in circles. Or the forest is messing with us," Lily suggested, her voice trembling. "Don't be ridiculous," Ethan snapped, though even he wasn't convinced. "We just need to stay calm and—" Suddenly, a distant, childlike giggle echoed through the trees, freezing them in their tracks. Did you guys hear that?" Sarah asked, her voice barely a whisper. "Who would be out here?" Mike questioned, his bravado slipping away. "Let's just keep moving," Ethan urged, though his eyes were wide with fear. They pressed on, but the forest seemed to close in around them, the trees growing impossibly dense. The giggling grew louder, now accompanied by soft, barely audible whispers. The friends huddled closer together, their flashlights flickering as if struggling to stay alive. "Ethan, I want to go back," Lily whimpered. "This isn't fun anymore." Ethan didn't respond. His face was pale, his eyes darting around as if searching for a way out. But the forest had them now, and it wasn't letting go. Chapter 3, The Lost Path. Minutes turned into hours as they wandered aimlessly through the forest, each step more desperate than the last. The trees seemed to shift and move when they weren't looking, the path behind them disappearing as soon as they passed. "This is impossible," Sarah breathed, her voice on the verge of panic. "We've been walking for hours. We should have found our way out by now." "There's something wrong with this place," Lily said, clutching her arms as if trying to ward off an unseen chill. "We shouldn't be here." Mike was about to respond when he froze, his flashlight flickering wildly before going out entirely. "What the?" he began, but his words were cut off as something brushed past him in the darkness. "Did you feel that?" Mike whispered, his voice trembling. "Feel what?" Ethan asked, though his voice was filled with dread. "I don't know, like something cold. Something touched me." Before anyone could respond, the giggling returned, louder and closer than before. It was joined by faint, ghostly voices, whispering unintelligible words. "Ethan, I'm scared," Sarah whispered, clutching his arm tightly. "I know. We all are," Ethan replied, his bravado completely gone. Then, without warning, the forest erupted into chaos. The whispers turned into deafening screams, the ground beneath them began to shake, and the trees groaned as if alive. The friends tried to run, but the forest fought against them, roots tripping them, branches clawing at their clothes and skin. "Keep going!" Ethan shouted, though his voice was lost in the cacophony. Lily was the first to fall, her foot caught by a root that seemed to come alive and wrap around her ankle. She screamed, reaching out for help, but was dragged into the darkness before anyone could react. "Lily!" Mike shouted, but it was too late. She was gone. Panic took hold as they realized the forest was toying with them, picking them off one by one. They sprinted through the trees, their hearts pounding, but no matter how far they ran, they were no closer to escaping. Chapter 4, The Final Stand. It was down to Ethan, Sarah, and Mike. Exhausted and terrified, they stumbled into a small clearing, the only place where the fog didn't reach. In the center stood an ancient, crumbling stone altar, covered in moss and strange symbols. "What is this place?" Sarah asked, her voice shaking as she stared at the altar. "It doesn't matter," Ethan said, panting. "We need to keep moving." But Mike was transfixed by the altar, his eyes wide with horror. "Guys, look." They turned to see what he was pointing at. Carved into the stone, barely visible beneath the moss, were 4 names: Ethan, Sarah, Mike, Lily. This isn't possible," Ethan stammered, his breath catching in his throat. His legs felt like lead, unable to move as the weight of what they were seeing pressed down on him. How are our names here?" Sarah's hand trembled as she reached out to touch the stone, tracing the letters of her name with her fingertips. "This must be some kind of sick joke." "It has to be." "No one could have known we were coming," Mike whispered, his voice barely audible. "We didn't even plan this until tonight." Ethan backed away from the altar, shaking his head violently as if trying to wake from a nightmare. "We have to go. We have to go now." The ground beneath them rumbled, and the whispers returned, more insistent than before. The trees around the clearing swayed, though there was no wind, and the fog that had receded began to creep back in, slowly at first, then faster as if drawn to the altar. "Run!" Ethan shouted, grabbing Sarah's hand and pulling her away from the clearing. Mike followed close behind, but the fog was faster, tendrils of it snaking through the trees and wrapping around their legs, pulling them back toward the altar. Ethan fought against it, but the fog was like ice, freezing his limbs and clouding his vision. He could barely see Sarah in front of him, her terrified face a blur as she struggled to keep moving. "Ethan, help me!" Mike's voice came from behind, filled with desperation. Ethan turned just in time to see Mike being dragged into the thick of the fog, his arms flailing wildly as he tried to claw his way free. "Mike!" Ethan shouted, trying to reach for his friend, but the fog was too thick, too cold. Within moments, Mike's screams were swallowed by the darkness, leaving only silence in their wake. "Ethan, we can't stay here!" Sarah cried, her voice cracking with fear. With a final, desperate effort, Ethan managed to pull Sarah through the fog, stumbling back onto what seemed like a path. The fog continued to encroach, the whispers turning into maniacal laughter as if the forest itself was mocking them. They ran until their lungs burned and their legs felt like they would give out. But no matter how far they went, the fog followed, relentless in its pursuit. Finally, they collapsed against a fallen tree, gasping for air, their bodies shaking with exhaustion and fear. "We're never getting out of here," Sarah whispered, tears streaming down her face. "We're going to die here, Ethan." Ethan wanted to tell her she was wrong, that they would find a way out, but the words caught in his throat. Deep down, he knew she was right. This forest wasn't just haunted, it was alive, and it wanted them. Maybe if we stay here, the fog won't reach us," Ethan suggested weakly, though he knew it was a futile hope. But Sarah wasn't listening. Her eyes were fixed on something behind him, wide with terror. "Ethan, look." He turned slowly, his heart pounding in his chest. The altar they had just escaped from was standing right in front of them, its ancient stone bathed in an eerie, greenish light. The names were glowing now, as if the forest was branding them, marking them as its own. How is this possible? Ethan breathed, his voice shaking. Before Sarah could answer, the ground beneath them began to shift, the earth rippling like water. The whispers grew louder, forming words now, dark and ancient, spoken in a language neither of them could understand. But the meaning was clear. Asterisk, you are ours. Asterisk. The ground split open beneath them, and they were thrown to the ground as roots and vines erupted from the earth, wrapping around their arms and legs, pulling them down. The altar loomed above them, its surface now covered in a swirling mist that coiled like snakes. "Ethan!" Sarah screamed, trying to free herself, but the roots were too strong. Ethan fought with everything he had, but it was no use. The forest had them in its grip, and it wasn't letting go. As they were dragged toward the altar, Ethan caught a glimpse of something in the mist, figures, pale and ghostly, their eyes hollow and their mouths twisted into cruel smiles. He recognized them immediately, they were the ones who had ventured into the forest before them. Their spirits trapped, doomed to wander the forest for eternity. The roots pulled them closer to the altar, the mist curling around them, cold and suffocating. Ethan reached for Sarah, but she was already being pulled under, her screams echoing in his ears as the mist swallowed her whole. "Sarah," he cried, his voice raw with desperation. But it was too late. The last thing Ethan saw before the darkness claimed him was the altar, glowing with a sickly green light, the names now fully illuminated. His own name burned into his mind as the whispers became a roar, filling his ears, his mind, his soul. Asterisk, you are ours. Asterisk. The next morning. The sun rose over Ravenswood the next morning, casting a pale light over the forest's edge. The townsfolk went about their daily routines, unaware of the horrors that had taken place within the Forest of Whispers the night before. At the edge of the forest, just visible through the trees, stood the ancient stone altar, now silent and still. The fog had receded, leaving behind only the faintest trace of mist clinging to the ground. On the altar, four names were carved into the stone: Ethan, Sarah, Mike, and Lily. The names glowed faintly in the morning light, a warning to all who might dare to enter the forest. And deep within the Forest of Whispers, if you listen closely, you could hear the faintest sound, the echo of screams, the distant whispers of those who were lost, and the laughter of the forest as it claimed its next victims. The forest had what it wanted, for now. But it would always hunger for more, waiting for the next group of curious souls to enter its dark embrace, to add their names to the altar, and to join the voices that whispered in the night. And so, the legend of the Forest of Whispers lived on, a place where the brave, the foolish, and the curious went in search of adventure, only to find terror beyond their worst nightmares, a terror from which they would never return.
Don't forget to subscribe.